The conversation surrounding sex and gender has become a minefield for broadcasters. Did Front Row's presenter step on one?
A very shouty minority persistently attacks Miss Rowling and misrepresents her views. Your presenter has unjustifiably added fuel to this misrepresentation.
Does Tom Sutcliffe agree? In feedback this week, I'll ask him if he misrepresented the popularity of J.K. Rowling's views and bracketed her with sex offenders. Off the record, many broadcasting executives, editors and presenters have told me that covering the sex and gender controversy can be a nightmare. The danger is that they'll just not touch the topic at all for fear of the likely response. Not so Tom Sutcliffe. In last week's Front Row, he discussed the philosopher Eric Mathis' book Drawing the Line with its author and explored the relationship between artworks of all kinds and the morality of the minds behind them. Is it morally permissible to enjoy the work of artists whose personal views, and indeed lives, are reprehensible, even criminal? Well, some of you felt the discussion crossed a line when the author of Harry Potter was mentioned.
Do you think there's a major philosophical distinction between artists who have committed crimes, have been found guilty of crimes, and artists who simply have unpopular opinions? I mean, you bring up the case of J.K. Rowling, who clearly has a very unpopular opinion regarding gender identity, and has, as a consequence of that, has faced severe and serious criticism. Are those the same things, or is something different happening in that case?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think there are differences.
This is Nigel Scott from London. The BBC is going to have to get a grip on the way it covers women and their rights, and reverse the way they have been sidelined in the name of trans inclusivity. The icing on the cake was in Front Row on 24th of March, when a discussion on art and morality with Eric Mathis managed to conflate the entirely reasonable views of J.K. Rowling with the life of child abuser Eric Gill. Rowling's views are only out of line with extreme transgender campaigners.
This is Alex from Merseyside. I was horrified to hear Tom Sutcliffe repeatedly attack J.K. Rowling. After discussing whether the art of R. Kelly and Eric Gill should be viewed differently following their identification as sex offenders, he bracketed J.K. Rowling with them and repeatedly referred to her in a way that clearly implied his negative feelings. J.K. Rowling's view reflects the law in England. Sutcliffe does not.
Sarah from Sussex. I have just been listening to Front Row and was dismayed to hear the presenter say that J.K. Rowling's views were unpopular. They are certainly not unpopular with middle-aged women, old women, everyone who writes for The Spectator, Janice Turner who writes for The Times, middle-aged men, old men, Suzanne Moore who used to write for The Guardian and now writes for The Telegraph, etc. Many people agree with J.K. Rowling's views and are just too frightened to say so.
Well, I'm delighted to be joined by the presenter of Front Row, Tom Sutcliffe. Tom, can I deal with the first of those complaints, which says that you bracketed J.K. Rowling with R. Kelly and Eric Gill, who are sex offenders? Do you accept that's what you did?
I don't think we bracketed her with them. I think we made the point that this was a different case, that there was a spectrum of things here, from crimes having been committed to having opinions which aren't shared by every reader. So I don't think that's quite true. She was at one end of a very broad spectrum of responses that is covered in this book.
But how about the other complaint there, where you said that she had an unpopular opinion, views that were unpopular? In the view of the criticism you've heard put forward by Sarah and others, do you think you were wrong to say that?
Yes, I think I was wrong. I don't think it's wrong to say that her views are unpopular, because they clearly are with the sector. But I think in hindsight, I should have done two things. I should have questioned Eric Mathis a bit more closely about whether his characterization of responses to her work just extrapolated from a very small, narrow world, which is essentially American academia. You know, he works in a Massachusetts college, and what is consensus in a Massachusetts college is not a consensus everywhere. And following that up, I do think I should have been much more explicit about the fact that many, many people do not think that J.K. Rowling's views are bigoted, which is the word that he used. It's a fair criticism to say that I left the impression that there's only one way of thinking about these things, when in fact that is anything but the truth.
You know, I feel a bit of a hypocrite asking you about these questions because this is recorded, and if I do something daft, it's edited out. You were doing this live, of course.
Well, I was.
As you always do.
And interestingly, I've been thinking about this a lot because of the complaints, and I looked at my notes, and my question to Eric Mathis, as written out in my notes, much more explicitly stated that many people don't accept this view. But I don't always stick to my written questions when I'm doing a live interview, because live interviews are dynamic. The interviewee responds in a way you hadn't expected. They answer a question you're going to ask in 3 questions' time. You know, so you're constantly thinking of things. And I think certainly one lesson I would have learned is if you're going to walk through a minefield, you know, have a very good map and stick to it.
Well, this is a minefield, and it's a particular minefield in many ways for men. Not to say slightly older men, as we both are to talk about. And I get into talking to people quite high up in the BBC and other presenters, a genuine sense of nervousness about discussing these issues. And of course, that's a real danger in itself, isn't it? The idea that we're so terrified that we'll use the wrong words, that we don't dare deal with the issues. Do you feel that sort of pressure when you move into these areas?
Well, I think you always feel this pressure, and it is partly because of social media, because, as it were, you know that there will be a response. And that's understandable. People feel very, very strongly about it. And I think that was my mistake in this, was not to give a voice to that counter view. Because people are capable, I think, of listening to views that they don't like, as long as they don't feel that they've been excluded entirely or not acknowledged.
But the aim of some people, and I've heard this called intellectual terrorism, is to capture the language. In other words, they don't want, as it were, people to have an opportunity to put forward their argument. They try and shoot them down almost before they speak in any detail by A, criticising them as individuals, and B, criticising the language they use, trying to appropriate the language for their cause. So we never get to, as it were, a debate, because people have been almost disqualified beforehand.
No, well, I thought that was one of the interesting things here. I mean, this wasn't a debate, this item on Front Row wasn't a debate about J.K. Rowling's views on gender. It was about the ways in which people feel about artworks and the people who've made them and the connections between those. And I thought J.K. Rowling was an interesting case to talk about here, because even those who criticise her views on gender recognise the moral quality of the books, and indeed very often praise them. That's why I brought up Daniel Radcliffe. Some listeners were angry about that. They thought I was citing him against her. In fact, I was saying he had recognised in her book moral qualities, and it seemed an odd paradox that this person that you would dismiss out of hand, in one case, you would recognise that they had put into their book qualities of tolerance and compassion, so on.
I found it, actually, we're listening to the programme, a fascinating discussion. And now, of course, there's the issue of a Russian cultural boycott and the question of whether Russian artists should be held in some ways responsible for the activities of a dictator who happens to run their country. So it's a very, I mean, this never goes away, this argument, does it?
No, I don't think it ever goes away, but I think there are new facets to it, and that J.K. Rowling illustrates one of those. There is now, to a much greater degree, I think, fans and readers want artists to align with their views exactly in a way that perhaps might not have been the case in the past. And so that was one of the reasons I thought it was legitimate to talk about her in this larger context.